Hi everyone, thank you for making time. It's lunch, so please feel free to get snacks. If you need to run out, please do so. I do appreciate your time. I am standing between you and food, and we know Maslow's hierarchy. Hello. I'm going to be talking about my research specifically on the Japanese influencer industry markets today. I'm quite excited to do this because in reflecting on my fieldwork with my HDRs last week, I realized I haven't spoken about Japan to CCAT, and this is the first time, so let's see how this goes. But first, a request. I am debuting a lot of brand new data, pictures, concepts, theories here. They are still either work in progress or in papers and books under review. So if you do see this icon, I ask that you do not take any screen grabs or photos or circulate them. All right, let's do a bit of orientation. The data from today's project is coming from 3 different angles. The first of these angles is my ongoing research looking at social media pop cultures, which is the program I run in CCAT. We broadly look at things like memes, virality, online artifacts, and vernacular like emoji in order to find out how these are new forms of people and artifacts and projects trying to constitute ways of speaking that transcend text or the audio form. This is also funded mostly by my ARC DECRA project for the last 3-ish years plus parental leave, looking at East Asian influences in the various industries. So for today, you're going to get snapshots from this aspect of fieldwork at the bottom, looking specifically at Tokyo. And last but not least, some of the research I'm going to be referencing today is brand new from the IER lab. And we have today some members, including Rachel Robinson, HDR student, and Jin Lee, who is one of our research fellows. The outline for today, I'm going to very, very briefly cover some of the approaches to the influencer industry and the different ways we can study this sort of phenomenon. I want to share some snippets of the lab projects that have informed my thinking in general and have also been a result of my DECRA work. And then the meat of today's talk focuses on my field work from the DECRA project, as well as a theory I'm building on intercultural influences. So to be clear, a subset of this theory focuses on the idea of cultural experience influences and agencies, which we'll get to at the end, followed by some side notes and caveats, because all academics do that. Approaches to the influencer industry. So in general, rather than talk you through a literature review, a historiography, or ways of how I have done this research, I figured a more productive manner for anyone from different disciplines to come to this is to ask ourselves, what are we really talking about when we say influencers? When we say influencers are vain, influencers are bad, influencers cause misinformation, where are we coming at in the Venn diagram? And I want to offer that broadly, there are 3 different ways most of the mainstream discourse is coming at. The first one is influencers as a culture of practice. This is where we talk about things like, showcasing behind the scenes of your life, broadcasting your life, parasocial relations, so you feel really, really close to me even though we've never met. And those are all influencer literacies and practices that by now have become quite mainstream given the pandemic, work from home cultures, LinkedIn, and the idea of self-promotion across many entrepreneurial industries. In the second one, we think about influencers as a concept and as a role. We think of them, say, in contrast to mainstream celebrities, where they're meant to be more accessible, more believable, and easier for people to feel that it's attainable, whatever they're modeling to you. Because, for one, in the mainstream industry, we tend to think of those people as being in the higher echelons of society. When they talk about class in their daily habits, we're thinking about the top 1%. And influencers traditionally from the grassroots definition are meant to be your girl or your boy next door that feels accessible. When we think about the role of the influencer, we usually try to think about how they're mediators. So if I have a message and I want it to reach my target audience, but I'm not particularly fun or sexy as a brand, I get someone else to be my loud hailer, my mediator, or my interpreter to disseminate that in a fun way. Some of the most salient examples of this in the APAC region, where I mostly work, pertains to things like sexuality education. where a lot of young people do not get access to that properly in schools, or parents think it's taboo to talk about it because of religion and culture. And so influencers come out and talk about the first time they had sex, or protection, or STDs. And while you may think it's sensational in just the YouTube ecology or in the drama industry, if you situate that in the cultural and political context of some APEC countries, that's the only avenue that young people are getting information from that is not passed through or screened by the school or by parents or any other form of traditional morality. So that's where we think about influencers more fruitfully as a concept and a role. Now, most recently in this era, we are also thinking about influencers as a platform. We're thinking about those who are not just the super mega big folks who are amplifying messages. We're also thinking about the micro influencers who might probably just exist in a group chat of 1,000 people. It's paywalled, it's gate capped, only 1,000 people ever get my info. But these are 1,000 people who are there and who would hang on to every word I say. So these influencers now in the age of misinformation have become very important gatekeepers, filters, even architects of information and misinformation, far above and beyond the traditional understandings of, hey, I took a selfie to sell you this product, or saying, hey, girlfriend, I want you to feel like you're my friend, even though we don't need each other, we don't meet each other. So these three facets of how we can go into the studies of influencers help us understand what is the placeholder. What are we really talking about when we talk about influencers? All right, these two charts are bits that I always show in order to situate which part of my research I'm talking about today, given that I do study the back end to the front end of the whole industry, and I also take a sociological perspective to look at the technical, cultural, social, and economic. For today's talk specifically, we are moving away from the influencers themselves and going towards the industry, specifically the industry here, looking at the agencies. So these might be the folks who are in charge of grooming, harvesting, training influencers, or they might be the folks who are managing the clients. They might be the folks who are managing the followers in order to funnel them to the influencers. Think about them as side characters. We don't really feel that they're there front and center, but without there's someone laughing at your joke or being the supporting cast, the main person can't really stand out and there's no impact. So we think about that agency as that unseen, important right-hand person. Now in this grid, the sociological perspective, today's focus is mostly on the cultural. I want to see how these agencies are shaping the way we think about a nation, a society, influencers, or in today's case, culture as packaged for a tourist. So again, we are going to be talking about things to do with authenticity, veracity, matching, so on and so forth. But we're not looking to verify whether something is real or not. We're looking to verify whether or not it's packaged well enough that a tourist believes this is symbolism or this is authentic enough. Let me give you a case in point. A few years ago, before Crazy Rich Asians came out, every time I told anybody I grew up in Singapore, their first reference was, oh my gosh, your streets are so clean. There are so many dustbins. Your government is terrifying. They put people in jail for saying all sorts of things that would be considered free speech in other countries. Now that Crazy Rich Asians has become a global phenomenon, the framework for how people talk to me as a tourist would be, oh yeah, I went to this location in the movie, I went to that location in the movie. I know the real Singapore because I saw with my eyes what the movie said Singapore was about. So it didn't really matter to them all of that pre-context that other people might have had, which is equally authentic and representative of Singapore. But for the tourist, their imaginary was satisfied. So this is the frame that I'm taking today when I say tourism and authenticity. It's not about the actual veracity or the matching or the local experience or a genuine experience. It's always about satisfying something you already imagined to be and then that happening. So let's say coming to Perth, that would be seeing quokkas at Rottnest and then eating caramel koalas and then having someone give you that meme about this is a knife, or like, you know, saying good day or introducing you to Vegemite. You need to hit all of those bingo cards to feel like, yes, I have visited Australia. I need to buy these things and bring them home to show my kids, yes, I have visited Australia. So that's the level we're operating at. I want to also give us a caveat to say that this is not any less or more shallow or detailed. It is a different framework of study, mostly coming from the field of sociology, where we talk about sociology of tourism, and we talk about projection, or we may talk about different positionalities. So it's just a different angle from coming at what we think of authenticity. With the influencer production pipelines, I oftentimes also tend to focus on the influencer and how they produce their work as a one-person show. But today's focus is on the agencies and how groups of people in an agency may come together to inform what this person puts out there or inform the content that is actually broadcast on screen, but in the namesake and in the face sake of this influencer, as if it came from one person. All right, that's that for background, and I'm really excited to now give you some snippets of our lab projects. One of the first very major things we've been working on for quite some time now is called Platformed Creator Discourse, and we've got 2 reports that are being worked on. I want to especially say thank you to our lab RAs, Darcy, Morgan, and Jia Guo, who are leading the projects in English and Chinese respectively. In brief, for each of these projects, we're looking at 6 English language and 6 Chinese language platforms. We're studying the platforms in detail, including their governance structures, moderation policies, monetization opportunities, for us to understand what do they mean when they say influencer. And obviously, depending on the platform, if you've got a different practice or genre, like streaming or posting or text, an influencer looks different. But depending on the market, depending on what genre you are in, how much money you earn, there are also different thresholds for whether or not someone is considered an influencer. So this has been very useful in trying to decenter our baseline and to operate out of that market to evaluate influencers. In today's talk, this means shifting our orientation to what Japan thinks influencers are, how they govern, how they use international or their local variants of platforms in order to do this work. A second major project that's being worked on by our research fellow, Dr. Jin Lee, our RA's PhD student, Naomi Robinson, another research fellow, Sijun Shen, and another RA, Jiako, is our influencer library and our Wang Hong library. It is literally, as it says, it's literally a library of all the scholarship ever produced on influencers in English and in Chinese, peer-reviewed, vetted through a very strict schema of disciplines that we're looking at. And from this is sort of a verification exercise to support some of the observations I've made over the years. So for instance, when did we shift from using influencer to creator? When did we shift from using micro-celebrity to influencer? When did we shift from talking about influencers as being young, cute, vain women to influencers being political voices who are important, who can talk about society? When did we shift from talking about influencers as user-generated peoples and contents back in the days of YouTube to partners of platforms who help to build the features together? So with the English corpus, we've got 14 different groups based on types of disciplines we've put together. But in the Chinese corpus, given that disciplines work quite flexibly, we've decided to then go by format, followed by going by interest group or topic. This is also strategic based on our study of how the Chinese government gives out major grants, similar to the ARC for projects. They tend to be idea or topic focused. So something that looks at silver influencers, which are your elderly influencers, might come from an angle of commerce or discipline or health, but it will not be highlighted as much as the topic itself. So that's how we've elected to do our curation. A project that I'm wrapping up in lieu of my DECRA also wrapping up is figuring out how people name their jobs. So when you say someone is an influencer versus a KOL, which is a key opinion leader, or a KOC, which is a key opinion customer, or these days, a KOO, a key opinion opiniator, it comes at the angle of the theory or the concept. You know, the case here, the key opinion thing, tends to refer to marketing literature. Who gets to be the mediator to influence everybody else? The celebrity and micro-celebrity originally started from media studies, digital media studies, because the scholars there were trying to differentiate the reach you have with the internet, being wide but also very, very deep, versus the reach you have with Hollywood, just very, very wide but shallow. So the terms link to that. If we go by platform and norms, the different terms also imply different types of legitimacy, power dynamics, and populism. So for instance, for YouTube and TikTok, it pays to say I'm a YouTuber, I'm a TikToker, because they have very robust creator programs, and you can literally get certified, go through a curation, earn a certain number of followers to say, yes, I am a certified partner. I do not just earn from the small cents you accumulate through advertorials. YouTube actually pays me out a bigger fee. Whereas let's say we pivot to the Chinese market, whether you call yourself a partner, a creator, or a shangjia, which is the equivalent of a commercial partner, shows us where you're coming at, whether you are someone who partners with a platform and just invites people there through your live streaming antics, whether you're a creator who makes videos, makes short posts, or whether you're a shangjia who sells products on the app. So you're helping the platform to earn money through the brands they partner with, but you promote. So there are different types of influencers here. 3 and 4 are very straightforward. People also name their influencer job differently by their format and their practice. If you're a blogger or a vlogger, you might be born in the 80s if you're still using these words and you survive mainly on blogs or video vlogs. But these days, these exact same people are calling themselves streamers and cammers. I've even met one of my interviewees who called themselves a text streamer, meaning they live stream, but instead of seeing their face, you watch them type. So they're like typing a diary entry and you're just reading it word for word and people are commenting on the side. So when we talk about live journal back in the 90s and 2000s, this is literally live journal, but in the streaming form. Today's focus is from culture and market, where we try and demarcate the relevance of these specific influencer jobs, their value and their politics. For instance, the Zhubo, or the streamers in China, the BJs or broadcast jockeys in Korea, or in Japan, the Tarento, who are a class of miscellaneous D-list celebrity who often show up on talk shows or in variety shows, who are famous for being famous. That is literally their job scope. And because their job scope is just to draw people in, they are designated as the opinion haver that is very left of field. So if you look at any Japanese talk show or variety show, they're generally traditional roles. If let's say it's a team of 4, one of them will be the Tarento, and they will always be there to go, wow, sugoi, which means, wow, that's really amazing. Or they go, oh, nani, which means, are you sure? Just questioning. And their position is just there to show, here's a foreigner perspective, here's an outside perspective, here's a newbie's perspective, a novice perspective, and they're just there to add diversity so the conversation can flow in specific ways. Many influencers have ended up being Tarento in Japan because they look pretty much predominantly mainstream beautiful. They're usually young. They're usually representing the voice of people on the internet. When they say things like that in the mainstream media, it's meant to pull people into digital culture, or it's meant to pull people into very esoteric subcultures to push against the mainstream, to say, yeah, that's about right, but here are all these other rabbit holes that exist. What do we think? And that's their role. Last but not least, a project that I did a pilot study of myself this year, and I'd really like to get going when I come back from leave, is Influencer Imaginary. The pilot project looked at a list of Netflix productions or shows that Netflix has bought the rights to, and how they feature influencers in the storyline. So to be clear, I'm not talking about those reality shows where influencers come together, live on an island half naked, and then date. I'm talking about actual fictive storylines in these universes and how the influencers portrayed. And there are a lot of cultural ties here. In the interest of time, maybe I'll highlight 2. So let's look at this one, Feud Malls. It's a 2021 series from Taiwan. And in one of the episodes, this internet celebrity, whose name is Hua Mei, was found to have been abducted by a man, and he was live streaming the whole process of this live streamer being abducted and abused. In her whole ordeal, he makes her confess to many things, like, I flirt with many men. This gives you the imaginary that for a lot of these women live streamers in Taiwan, predominantly the audiences are men, and this person felt that he was being cheated just because he realized she wasn't flirting with just him, but with like 1,000 people who watch her live streams. He also forces her into other confessions to say things like, I have never used the products I advertise. So they're coming at the angle of lies. And again, against the backdrop of Taiwanese controversies where influencers were found to produce and recommend fraudulent products that they never verified but have put their name on. So these tell us about the context of how this society views influencers. Now, Crazy Rich Asians, since I've already talked about it earlier, this is a scene where there is a socialite called Radio 1 Asia. It's a scene where the male and female protagonists are in a quiet bar in New York and they're doing a cheers. And she's in the corner and she realizes, hey, this really rich man from a really rich family is dating this nobody. So she snaps a picture from New York. And in 2 minutes, the movie places it as if the whole of the island of Singapore has found out who this girl is and they have doxed her. And here the rhetoric behind this influencer is that they're gossipy. They have a lot of networks. You have to be careful what you say around them. They break the news quicker than your mother knows you're dating someone. So it's more of a positive light, but also stressing the connectivity of Singapore society where influencers are more efficient than the mainstream broadsheets where there's a lot of red tape. All in all of these examples and the larger study, influencers become a very useful conversation marker for what the baseline in society is. Do you generally think of them as people with potential to talk about death and dying in the hospice in a different way? Do we think about influencers as a genuine, profitable career for young people who are disenfranchised with how society is breaking, climate change is ruining our environment, there are no more jobs for us? Or are they taking a stance here where influencers are thought of to come from a very dark place, that they should be apologetic? And I find it to be very helpful in today's context, looking at where the baseline is in Japan. In the lab, one of the most important things we focus on also is whose stories are we telling? What case studies are we picking, not just by culture, but also by design, by class, by genre, by sexuality? And with the increasingly difficult ethical considerations we have to go through in this uni, with the foreign intervention laws that are coming through and the regulations and guidelines here, it's increasingly difficult to do research about minorities or on minorities. But I do think we have to persevere because this is just a snippet of some of the collections on studies of influencers outside of the global north. And yet they're often forgotten or cited less frequently than those produced in America. Hooray, my favorite aspect of today's talk, turning you to the snippets of my ARC fieldwork. Now, I won't go into very detail about the theory, the framing, the idea of why I chose East Asia. I want to talk about the actual empirical data and my experiences with people today. For context and transparency, the in-person pictures you see were based on my pre-COVID round of fieldwork in these 4 cities. But thankfully, maybe by design or by the virus just being kind, I managed to secure enough context such that subsequent field work happened digitally as planned, and any in-person visits were facilitated in the long haul because many of them were either passing through Singapore, and I happened to be there, or we managed to facilitate conversations through their partners here in Australia or their colleagues based elsewhere, close by in Southeast Asia. In other work, I've stressed repeatedly why we need to think about Asia Pacific as a region for influencers, despite the very big class disparity of the very rich, the very poor, affluence, education, ethnic groups, religiosity, and sexuality and gender being very contested topics. In general, when global, quote-unquote, companies come to invest in Asia Pacific influencers, they mostly think about the ease of trade within the region, where you can travel easily, where influencers from one country can promote to another country. They also think a lot about popular nationalism, where even governments are endorsing and using influencers either to promote a party, a campaign, sometimes a whole governance system, or these days, a political campaigny electoral board. So snippets of research. Now, some of my research comes at a very basic level. What are the influences in these countries? What are the genres? What do they do to push those cultures of that market? So it's unidirectional broadcasting, such as this channel ETL. They're a multi-channel network on YouTube, but all of their contents are cross-posted onto YouTube from Chinese video platforms. So on YouTube, the subtitling is slightly different. The titles and the cover images are all slightly different from the Chinese platforms because here they're explicitly addressing A, foreigners, and B, Chinese diaspora, especially those who may have never grown up in China or those who are second and third gen living outside of China. So the discourse is slightly different when they're posting the exact same video on the Chinese platform speaking to a domestic audience. Apart from visiting the studio and interviewing a few of their top executives as well as their creators, I got the chance to tour their actual studio where these videos are made. And they've also launched a series of ETL shops where, if after watching, say, a video about interior design, you really like a lamp that they casually mention 5 times in 10 minutes, you can go to the ETL store and buy it from that shop. Now, what's happening here? Are we becoming like reverse e-commerce, anti-e-commerce? Because the whole idea of online selling was online buying. You never have to leave home and change out of your pajamas. As it turns out, that industry is so saturated in China, it became a selling point that people could go to a shop and touch the thing before they bought it. And while millennials might remember this reversal, Gen Z found this to be a whole novelty that you could actually see the thing that you saw on YouTube before buying it. So that was their clientele. And in response to that clientele, the aesthetics is also very minimalist. It's very odorless, in the words of Koichi Iwabuchi. You can't really tell what age it is, which angle it's coming from culturally. Another group of my informants are a bit more nuanced, where they mix across cities, cultures, or countries. This is one example where I got to view a regional brand campaign launching across Asia. This specific instance was me following the brand Valley from South Korea as they launched in Shanghai. But I had other opportunities to also visit the different campaigns in various countries. So I was really, really blessed to be able to follow this Hong Kong-founded, Macau-supported, China-based influencer industry who focuses on bringing Europe into East Asia and East Asia into Europe. And they invited me to be their +1 at this event. My job as an anthropologist wanting hands-on work was literally to set up all of these bags, set up these makeup and these bits. But in exchange, I got to follow this campaign for the whole week that they were touring in Shanghai. This is an example of the South Korean CEO with her translator interviewing, using Chinese mainland influencers to talk about her product. But in the audience were Hong Kong-based influencers who had flown in from the event, as well as tier 2, 3, 4 influencers who came from Greater China. So for people who may not be acquainted, it just sounds like Asians selling things to Asians using Asians. For people who know Asia, it sounds like Koreans using mainland Chinese folks and Hong Kongers to sell things to other Asian Chinese. But if you live in China, the nuance here is so clear because you have a favorable foreign brand that has got a lot of credibility from South Korea, using top-tier first world city, Shanghai-based influencers to market to the more rural second, third, fourth tier cities, also inviting folks from the other entities like Hong Kong. So in this ecology, the regionality is very specific if you know where everyone is coming from. This is an extension of the brand campaign. This ended up becoming one of the bilateral agreements where companies decided to officially sign an agreement to support flows between South Korea and Hong Kong, as well as South Korea and Shanghai. So to facilitate the flow of products moving, of influencers visiting each other's companies and territories in order to market products. Again, here's a snippet of the setup behind the scenes. This board that you see here is where all the influencers signed their names, and all of this took place on the rooftop of the very beautiful Yu Yuan Gardens, which is a heritage site in Shanghai. All right, we now go to another fieldwork location, this time in Hong Kong. These group of influencers here flew in again from Macau, Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4. Okay, watch for them to disperse. That's my favorite part. You know, the photo was just amazing. Everyone was smiling, and once it was taken, it's like I've never met you, even though we just leaned up close for the selfie. I experienced this several hundred times all through the years with these influencers I've studied. All right, some orientation. Bonjour is a group, a chain of pharmacies in Hong Kong. It's similar to something like Chemist Warehouse, but they sell really good priced makeup. To promote Bonjour, the agency from Greater China that I followed, NSC, invited a group of Tier 2, 3, 4 Chinese tourists to go on a trip to Hong Kong to visit all the different Bonjour shops that they had. But along the way, you know, they also partnered with other companies. So you had to eat at this restaurant, you had to go to this shop in order to hit your pit stops of everyone in the brand. But I was also really fortunate to be able to interview some of these influencers who were telling me things like, oh my gosh, I need to learn how to differentiate myself from that Tier 2 person because I'm Tier 3. And my audiences know I'm Tier 3. But if we're all standing in the group photo together, taking pictures of the same product, how will people know we're different? And it's important that we're different because we've got different market audiences. If we compete for the same market, either one of us is going to be replaceable to the brand next year. So it's a win-win-win situation for everyone that we mark ourselves distinctively. The one man that you see in that picture has been the one solo man in this group for a long time. And he tells me if it's not him, it's person number 2. If it's not them, it's them. So they're very cognizant of who their placeholder or who their category substitution is and want to stay in their niche rather than diversify. Another bit of field work. Easter egg, this is Jin and I when we were babies. This is actually the first time I met Jin in 2019, where she was my fieldwork translator. And you know, she did so well, and now we're here. We're very lucky to have her at Curtin for us for a few years now. This is cross-cultural knowledge conduits, but this time looking at Seoul. The list here is so diverse, I don't even really know how to begin. There are folks here who are Korean, but who have lived in Germany and have made their entire careers about promoting German culture to Koreans. There are folks here who happen to be gifted with a whole range of British accents and have made it their career that they can speak English better than the English do, and who have appeared on the BBC dozens and dozens of times for the most rural of accents. There are folks here who used to be doctors and surgeons by their profession, but decided to branch into the influencer business industry to talk more about beauty as a way to launch their own private practices. And I'm really proud to say that as of today, this person has launched their practice, even though when we first met, we were talking about rentals and branding and names. So this has been an amazing array of young people throughout South Korea who choose to do cross-cultural knowledge conduits in different ways. Sometimes it may come across as an owner of a bookstore as such, who curates books that's not easily found elsewhere, or who curates the translation of books into Korean. Other times, the influencers pen books themselves to talk about their experiences in order to diversify the knowledge and cultural pool. Today's focus, though, is Japan. And this falls under my larger research trajectory looking at foreigner snapshots. Some of them are the CEOs and producers of some of the biggest virtual influencers. Some of them, which I do not have permission to show their faces of, they focus on showing me where they would take international clients to show them a different side of authentic Japan because you flew in from the US. And then, you know, the outside looks very Japanese. And I went in there and it was like a French bar with cello music, which is so not authentic in any of the 3 cultures. Some of them talk to me about the careers they've retired from, such as their previous life as influencers and creators and where they are now today in the industry. Prior research on this, I have looked at a version of that in South Korea, and of the many projects, Jin and I authored a paper looking at the Waegugin, or the foreigner national influencers in Korea. We found so many different issues, but in this paper in particular, we found that among the Waegugin, there are also class and color-based disparities, where local companies would prefer a white presenting Regogen over an Asian presenting or a black skin presenting one, because that was the favorite type of flavor of nationalism that was foreign enough, but also admired and respected enough. So there is the glow of the halo effect, but it's not too distant that people didn't find you too exotic. There were also a lot of instances of racism, and we haven't fully mined that data in our work, but I'm sure we'll continue to write about that. Today's talk focuses on these folks, so a subset of the intercultural influencers in Japan, our experience brokers. In short, there are two types of experience brokers. If, let's say, I was going to a foreign country for the first time, and if I was my parents' age, I might just go to a tour guide and pick up a booklet and say, all right, I will go through these programs. If I was young Gen X or old millennial, I might go onto Wikipedia or Google or any of these travel hub websites and then check through the forums. Young millennials and Gen Zs go straight to influencers to find out what do they recommend, especially if you're an intercultural influencer. Say if you're a foreigner who has been living in that city for many years and you can claim, I'm 1 foot in each zone. I know what is real and authentic enough, but what is comforting for you. So come with me and I'll broker the experience in the right way. So you get half your tourist imaginary satisfied, Crazy Rich Asian style, and then you get half the actual gritty, grotty aspect of the city from these influencers. So those are one bit, the cross-cultural influencers being experience brokers. Now, many of these influencers are either groomed or hired by these experience broker agencies. They are groups of people like that who focus on producing experiences, as I've mentioned, either by linking up with influencers, hiring them as tour guides, or furnishing tourists with these experiences themselves based on the knowledge that they get and pay these cross-cultural influencers for. So there are two ways. You can either go through the individual influencer or go through the agency, which oftentimes also happens to be an MNC, a multi-network channel company managing several influencers. So let's go ahead now to the theory that I'm trying to build in this book I'm finishing called Theorizing Intercultural Influences. Above and beyond just being a foreigner in a country that has lived there for a long time, there are many other types of intercultural influences, like international families, international couples, in which case for these ones, there's a lot of back and forth and travel and mobility. So your experience in that specific aspect for tourists. There might be mixed race persons or immigrants who squarely live between cultures, but there are also the loosey-goosey ones like expats who stay in a place for a short time but have done it over and over so they can tell you the template of how to be a tourist, or digital nomads who are just very connected online who can point you to resources. Operationally, there are at least 6 top-level categories of intercultural influences, and of these 6 today, the influences that I refer you to come from a mix of all 6. In words, intercultural influences are cultural arbiters. They arise from the in-between spaces of global exchange and juxtaposition. So if I was a very successful intercultural influencer as a Singaporean living in Australia, if I take this knowledge and stay here in Australia and preach to Australians, I would not be considered very authentic because the audience probably knows more than I do. Whereas I'm only knowing this from a level of having lived here for like 13 years as opposed to someone who was born here. If I took all of my knowledge and went back to Singapore, I may not be considered authentic because I don't live in Australia anymore. I'm just doing this based on the memory. So the most authenticity I have is if I continue living here, but if my target audience is still displaced in Singapore. The displacement of the audience is very important. It means my authority is contingent. It means I have to continuously commodify cultural norms. It means I'm usually mediating my performance for a culturally displaced audience. So these are very situational influences. The bit that you see there in blue is because if you want an Easter egg or if Q&A gets very awkward and quiet, we can go into the blue rabbit hole and I can tell you more about the contingency of authority. So keep that in mind if we get awkward later. All right, the expansion, since this is coming out in a book format, So far, the books on influencers have focused on a specific country market, content genre, platform, case study. I tried really hard to try and frame my first book to be a provocation, to offer a new idea or theory or framework. The same thing is happening here with intercultural influencers, where rather than give case studies or talk about a genre, I want to talk about a new theory here, where your celebrity, your knowledge, your authority, your influence is all situational, depending on who's watching and who's not. So this culturally displaced audience that we talk about, it could be physical bodies, it could be the platforms, it could be my algorithmic tactics to make sure some people on TikTok never see me and question my authority, and only these people on TikTok see me, so I maintain my reputation and credibility. It's a lot of strategy and skill from the platform side, audience management side, and the individual curation. As I say, they're a new generation of influencers. They operate across cultures, country markets, so on and so forth. They are massive and they're mobile, and they're cosmopolitan figures who demonstrate the potentials of riding the wave. Now, being an intercultural influencer is great because all of a sudden, if K-dramas are very popular and I'm an Australian teaching English in Korea, I could focus and pivot to talk about, here are the K-dramas that I recommend after having lived in Korea for 2 years. If you really think about it, how does that give you any more authority to recommend K-drama over other people? Not much, but this is how we brand ourselves these days in YouTube statements. If all of a sudden mukbang is the flavor of the day, I can say, here's what I feel about all the Korean foods as a vegan who lives in a city where there's meat everywhere. So you get to reposture and repackage yourself all the time depending on what the global wave is making hot at the moment. But as we will revisit at the end of my deck today when we talk about the side notes, there are also a lot of pitfalls and negative consequences when you fall into this template because you constantly need to brand yourself as being exceptional. You always have to find that mark of distinction. Unlike, say, people who are squarely in one genre and who only talk about that genre, like beauty, fashion, cosmetics, or sports, or children, because you have them for life, these folks need to keep rebranding, and if you don't, you risk falling out of the industry. So again, this was the definition I offered to you for intercultural influences. I want now to bring us into the last section where I bring you into the subset of them, which is the cultural experience agents. Sorry, this was the blue Easter egg I said I would talk about during Q&A if we want to. So here you have a 5-second preview if it interests you. It is a table in the way I think with my sociology brain, but we can get to that in a bit. Okay, I have 5 examples that I've selected for us today. They are very strategic. In the same way I open and talk to you first about cross-cultural influences and transited into cross-cultural agencies, these are 5 following that spectrum as well. First, Joshua Brown, also known as Gaijin Samurai a long time ago. Translation, Gaijin stands for foreigner. The more formal term is Gaikokujin. Gaijin is more of a derogatory term, so it's interesting he's adopted it for himself. Samurai, samurai, but it's also because he goes out on the street dressed as a white man in samurai costume, and he sees how people react to him. He tells me from his various videos that we watched and that we went through, sometimes he's there because he's interrogating other visible foreigners saying, you need to be quiet on the train, this is not Japanese etiquette. Gaijin Samurai is here to teach you how to be Japanese and respect the mores. Other times he goes out to these really cute old Japanese ladies just to see their reactions. Like he opens his mouth and speaks fluent Japanese and they're like, oh, Sugoi, you're so great. As if, we're not capable of learning different languages despite our bodies. But he knows this trope well. And he does it specifically to get the locals' insight, given that in the larger, wider socio-political context, Japan is still perceived as quite a xenophobic country that's not very welcoming to some types of foreigners. So those are his interventions there, with teaching people etiquette, teaching people lessons. Since then, after retiring that trope, he still works in the industry, this time as a producer, assisting other people. And here are snapshots of the work he's been involved in, either as host or as producer for various companies. So very visibly using his difference, cashing in on the stereotypes in order to tease out these intercultural intrigue or to start conversations. Number two, now we're moving one tier up to the agency level. Tokyo Creative is your very regular MNC, and they specifically agent, curate, workshop, incubate intercultural influences. Now, this is not the term they use. This is the term I use as a scholar coming ethically. But amicably, they call them their foreigner YouTubers or their expat YouTubers. In that most of their deck here review talents who are not Japanese, or at the very, very, very least, Japanese people who are hafus or mixed race, or Japanese people who have lived abroad their whole lives and are returning home to a reverse culture shock. So there's always that foreign element, and that's what the agency is there for. They host meetups with all of these YouTubers, and interestingly, a lot of these are friends of friends who may have gone there for exchange or for work, who then gradually take to videoing, YouTubing, and then becoming influencers because that's what all your friends are doing when they're there hanging out. I also got the whole experience of visiting their deck. Tokidoki Traveler here is one of ours from Australia, abroad in Japan, and Shamanda, she's also one of the long-term people I've interviewed. Recently announced their engagement. It surprised everyone because for a long time they were just thought of as these foreigners hanging out. Now, I put these buildings here for context because the different agencies I've studied range from struggling and successful startup all the way to one arm of like a super popular, famous multinational company. And it's hard to know online because things always look shiny on the internet. And I learned very quickly that in Japan, my placeholder for understanding where these companies stand and therefore the success behind the scenes is not just the neighborhood, because this is very, very swanky. It's oftentimes the actual building. You could be the poshiest building in a very dodgy neighborhood, or the most creepy, small, dilapidated building in a very posh Tokyo CBD Central. And oftentimes when I brought this up to my informants to talk about their actual success, they did not shy away from it and had very, very nuanced explanations for why they chose one or the other. This is Shiori. She's one of the very generous talent managers who's offered to give me her time, and she's also been my constant contact through the years. We bonded over the fact that in Japan, because she is tinier than most already tiny Japanese people, she's always perceived as a child or a person of schooling age, and she's just decided to use that to her advantage whenever she goes for industry events. People think she's a student who's doing YouTubing, without knowing that she's actually here and the manager of the biggest name YouTubers that they have at that function. So it's really nice to find these connections across cultures and to extremely bond over these sort of experiences. One more level up, agency, but a bit more further removed from human influences. This is Gantele and YS Media. They are two companies run by the same CEO, Yuki Seki. Their website is bilingual. They say they're an MCN for creators who are active overseas. So opposite of Tokyo Creative, where it's foreigners in Japan. For Gantale and YS Media, it's Japanese people who live everywhere else in the world, and they market overseas foreign brands back to people in Japan. I also want to do a special shout out here to my faceless translator RA here, Andrew Lee. Even though a lot of my informants were bilingual, when we got into the terminology of how the business works, when we got into the terminology and the specifics of things like racial prejudice, cultural prejudice, my informants often chose to represent their thoughts in Japanese. And so it was really useful to have this handy PhD student be my assistant. Now, the one case study from Gantele is Rin Asobi, who is one of the cross-cultural virtual influencers as a breakout star in the 2010s. Rin Asobi does not look like a regular virtual influencer because she's 2D. But in the Japanese industry, virtual influencers who are 2D are often just known as VR girls or Vocaloids. And there's a whole other type of genealogy for how we think of them, as opposed to the popular conceptions of someone like Lil Michaela. Now, Rin Asobi's cross-cultural potential is in her backstory. She was created from a nuclear explosion when American and Japanese scientists decided to work together and had a miscommunication of language. And so she was born. And as she was birthed, like the Powerpuff Girls are now realizing, she has both Japanese and American elements. What's happening in her storyline? Sometimes she is a person who is just saying, I'm lost in this world. Am I Japanese? Am I American? I've lost my cultural identity. And then American YouTubers come in and interview her. And she uses these opportunities to talk about either culture. Sometimes, because she's after all a nuclear explosion girl, she starts to talk about technology and what she feels about AI and masking and automated machine learning. So other companies and other brands get to embed that story. But you'll realize in all of her videos, this also takes the form of like an anime show. Every series has a plot line wherein Asobi is discovering more and more of herself, finding her true identity. Am I American? Am I Japanese? Am I a girl or robot? And it's that underlying storyline that's a very Japanese flavor that makes her distinct from the other virtual influencers who are more closely tied to your human influencers. Second last case study, we have Custom Media. Custom Media is a full-service digital media agency. Their selling point is that they're bilingual. The CEO, Robert here, was very kind to introduce me not only to his company, but later on spend some time with me to talk to me about his cross-cultural family after noticing that my features were very difficult to decipher, and he figured, like his children, I'm also mixed race. So I got to find out a little bit more about his motivations for wanting to be a bilingual hub. Now, they are data-driven. They say that they're marketing solutions-oriented, and this language is very intentional because they target corporations who may not know much about digital media, social media, and influencers, and then help them adapt. This might seem like a very strange strategy, but in a country like Japan where people still use fax machines, and where you still need people to stamp things rather than sign things electronically, this was a major intervention for him, like generationally, so I understand what he was doing. Now, something that I was not able to share in picture form, but Robert has given me his blessings to share verbally and in my research, is that following Custom Media, he launched a separate independent influencer agency focused on the specific topic of sustainability. Japan has a very big plastic problem with takeout and has a very big recycling issue. So he's wanting to educate Japanese citizens by way of influencers about environmentalism and build this not-for-profit company specifically to drive some of these profits into that to help cultivate social influencers. In one of my side notes later, I give you a bit more insight into this world, but if you'd like to chat more, in Japan, they're known as NPO influencers, or not-for-profit organization influencers, who sell not products, but different types of social messaging and ideology in a country that's usually more culturally and socially homogenous. Last example before we wrap. This is Rail Crow. Again, very nice location, super bustling, very expensive building, but the selling point that you really must know is that despite being one of the co-working spaces in the floor, they're right next to the train station, which makes this super duper upmarket and is a mark of their success, not just to me, not just to them, but for the foreigner clients who come to them to sell to Japan and vice versa. This was a really brilliant team that I met. The CEO, who's right at the back, was very insistent on taking not a selfie of two of us, but of his whole team, because one of their selling points is that the company is very diverse, and that because they're diverse, they get to deal with the topic of emotions. I'm not sure if anybody else has this context, but there's a stereotype that Japanese people are very bad at showing emotions. If you're angry at work, if you're a customer service operator, you have your straight customer service face. No one ever knows what you're thinking. It's also why a lot of these different rural areas have these houses where you can go and like dash objects, or there are these very safe outlets where you can go to and it's permitted for you to act out, whether aggressively in a sport or by throwing darts. So his way of selling the company differently is that we're diverse. We all live in Japan, but we come from different countries. Kept stressing the two people from Latin America. So yeah, we have feelings. We know how to navigate and help the foreign brands enter this market, but we know how to speak to this market as well. Okay, so now I need to give you the wordy definition. Having understood what cultural experience influencers and agencies are, this is what I told you about intercultural influencers, and as a subset, the cultural experience influencers and agencies, they are brokers positioned to offer easily accessible and condensed versions of the authentic local experience for tourists who are yearning for more. So again, my major research on East Asia, Japan as a subset. Within Japan, many different types of influencers. We looked at intercultural, and then among intercultural, we looked at cultural experience brokers. This green is here for you because it's another rabbit hole. If Q&A gets awkward and you want to talk about what authenticity means to people who work in this industry as influencers, we can go there. I want to wrap up in a few slides, 1-minute statements on a few things. One, what is the fallback for the influencers who practice this strategy? Because I did reference in the beginning that there are negative consequences. Oftentimes, if they want to remain successful in the industry, they find that they have to constantly rely on either over-exoticism of the self or misrepresentation of the self, which means you become a trope, you become your stereotypical persona and people remember you. But you also end up becoming very generalizable rather than going for your original intention of diversity. You're also very reflexively going for essentialism. And this is also that you maintain the authority of your ambassadorship. You need to match people's Crazy Rich Asians version of the imaginary in order for them to listen to you. So Matcha Samurai in various TikToks has said he has just elected that he'll always wear his outfit and speak in this exaggerated Japanese accented English because that's his TikTok brand. Another fallback I'll mention is that sometimes these intercultural influencers end up entangling themselves with conversations on social justice. And then rather than representing their group, they fight over minority celebrity. Rather than talk about the social justice and bringing awareness, they might commodify it for virtue signaling. And this is all embedded into the ethos of visibility and competing for attention in the influencer industry. 3 more 1-minute statements. Other than intercultural influencers, there's so many other genres of influencers in Japan alone. This one-page snapshot are the NPO, not-for-profit organization influencers. On the left here, we've got Coco Life. The influencer I interviewed does not want to be photographed, but this magazine focuses specifically on connecting people with disability in Japan. And while they first started out modeling their wares, recommending products to each other as if it was an online forum but in print, many of these ordinary people, especially in the Middle Ages and up, ended up becoming contacted by companies to be the face of things, the brand ambassador of various things. So we're going back to grassroots blogging representation, and Coco Life accidentally ended up curating influencers. Welji, CEO of the startup Sayaka, founded this agency in order to welcome refugees, so Welji, into Japan. And in order for her to spread this message, she turned herself into an influencer to get into the correct spots and places on the digital market in order to promote this awareness. These are the two. We've got Pellet Top and Drop Rainbow. They are both LGBT positive companies. One, trying to address bias through the format of comics. And CEO Asaya here turned herself into an influencer to do that. Whereas here, we've got the CEO of Drop Rainbow who has decided, yep, I need to turn myself to an influencer to market with entrepreneurs and give them sensitivity on the job training so they know how to embrace workers who are queer or to create queer safe spaces in their companies. So for each of these influencers, they became influencers to sell a social cause or a message or to support a business, which is very different from our traditional understanding of social media influencers going popular and then selling someone else's products and hawking them. All right, my last comment. You know, everything I talked about with intercultural influences today, I could have potentially used the exact same pictures, the exact same data, and given you a completely new argument if I was cutting my data up differently. For instance, if I focus just on the buildings and the cities that I talked about, so neighborhoods, are they expensive? Are they shoddy? Buildings, startups to the big NGOs and MNCs, we could have a whole conversation about the hierarchy of influencers, the industry, and how well they're actually doing. If I focus on all of these slide decks, and I was shown so many of them, as is the way in this industry, we could have also talked about the way people pitch differently. either based on the country market or the genre or even the class. In other papers, I've done studies of how we take photos at the end of my interviews. That ended up becoming a paper on selfies because all the influencers I met with always post the exact same way and I always look the same potato way. And then after years of practice, I realized this was a very learned skill. Selfies is tested labor. So I just want us to take a step back and realize I'm giving you a very specific interpretation and argument. I could make many different arguments about this if we focused on other things, but today we're focused on the cultural aspect when you're pitching to the tourist who wants a very specific version of authenticity. That's that. All right, I'm going to leave this here if we want it, but maybe I'll return the time to you.